Welcome everyone. So I'd like to begin today's call by acknowledging that we are calling from Indigenous land. As a settler myself and on behalf of the settler organization, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet and thank all of the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm calling in today from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, the area colloquially known as Gatineau. I invite everyone to share your name and the name of the traditional land that you're calling in from as well in the chat box. And while you're doing that, why don't I introduce today's session and our panelists. So we're here to discuss youth leading on issues that matter to them, climate, poverty, and affordability particularly. My name is Natasha Pei. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a manager of cities at the Tamarack Institute. And I'm here with my colleague co-hosting this, Mike.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Des Jardins. I'm the manager of sustainability and development for communities building youth futures with the Tamarack Institute.
So today's webinar is part of an important ongoing conversation about some of the key issues of our time, such as poverty and climate change, affordability, how they impact youth and how youth are already and wanting to engage around the issues that affect them. And I know youth can be a broad category. So Mike, tell us about how we're talking about youth today.
Yeah, everyone has a different definition of what youth means, but we're all working together towards supporting children and youth, having healthy and successful development and futures. But for today's purposes, we're defining it as 15 to 30-year-olds, to the exception of Children First Canada. Their report focuses on threats to children 0 to 18.
And so we started onto this conversation, this kind of webinar conversation, after reading several of the reports that today's panelists are responsible for, and found that what they were saying was really resonating with a lot about what we're hearing in our divisions at Tamarack, working with local collaboratives to build youth futures, to reduce poverty, and to work on climate change and climate adaptations. And we really wanted to share the voices of young people, young advocates and researchers, and what they're finding as well. So we have a really amazing panel that I'm excited for today. And I'm excited to introduce you to, first of all, Haleema, who serves as a Prime Minister's Youth Council member, advising government officials and government agencies on health, civic engagement, Islamophobia, and other topics through consulting local and national organizations. Raised in Markham, Ontario, Haleema is a Muslim Canadian and biomedical sciences and research student at York University. As a freelance writer, she has published her thoughts on high school education, Islamophobia, and social justice for the Toronto Star, Markham Economist and Sun, and My Voice Canada. We also have Manvir, who is the co-author of Canada's first ever State of the Youth report, which highlighted the issues faced across Canada and was released last year. She is also the founder and executive director of Ladia, Celebrating and Empowering Daughters. This nonprofit organization inspires South Asian daughters of all ages to become empowered. She also works as supervisor of direct services at Yellow Brick House, a women's shelter, and is the recipient of Brampton's 40 Under 40 in 2018. And as well, the Women Working in Social Activism on Behalf of Women and Children Award by the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. We also have Sydney, who was research lead on last year's Raising Canada 2021 Top 10 Threats to Childhood in Canada report by Children First Canada, and is continuing on the research team for the 2022 report. Sydney is a Ph.D. candidate in the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, and is simultaneously completing a collaborative specialization in bioethics through the Joint Centre for Bioethics at the University of Toronto. Her aim is to advance perspectives on childhood well-being, children's rights, and policymaking related to children's health care. And we have Fadumo. Fadumo is a senior data analyst for Youthful Cities and recently released the report Youthful Cities Real Affordability Index. She ensures data quality, collection, and analysis of youth data. Fadumo guides Youthful Cities in decision-making and programming, including the Healthy Breakfast Club at Fleming's Breakfast for Learning and co-founding Renaissance Youth Group. Fadumo has an undergrad degree in health studies from New York University and recently completed a postgraduate certificate specializing in operations management. So welcome Haleema, Manvir, Sydney, Fadumo, and thank you so much for joining Mike and I on today's panel. So to get us started, we wanted to start with, we can probably take down the screen share, see everybody today. We wanted to start with what's arising from the recent reports, the discussions that you've had with other youth throughout Canada, especially the recommendations, just the themes, what's coming up, what are people talking about related to poverty, equity, and climate. And Manvir, would you like to start that off based on the Canada's first State of Youth report?
For sure. Thank you so much, Natasha. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. I'd like to thank Tamarack, first of all, for having me here today. As mentioned, I co-authored the first ever State of the Youth report for the Government of Canada. This was last year, and I got the opportunity to work with 12 other young people across Canada. The report was a result of 90 consultations with 996 youth across Canada, and it highlights 6 key areas or issues or themes that youth are really, discussing and having conversations about it and essentially worried about when it comes to thinking about their futures. So these 6 themes were truth and reconciliation, environment and climate action, health and wellness, leadership and impact, employment, and innovation skills and learning. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about each theme and kind of, what stood out in the report in relation to today's conversation. So for truth and reconciliation, youth mentioned that it's important for them that Canada is actively working towards truth and reconciliation and addressing the needs of Indigenous youth in particular, most of who are not given equitable opportunities to begin with. Youth also felt that Indigenous languages and cultures need to be protected, taught, and celebrated in order for Indigenous youth to carry on keeping their cultures alive. Indigenous youth are also suffering from high rates of mental health needs, which needs to be addressed by providing them with more access to support, such as therapists, social workers, and school counselors, which we know there's a severe lack of currently. In terms of environmental and climate action, the report highlighted that although the climate crisis is one of the most important issues facing our generation today, youth are often left out of the conversation and the work that needs to be done. The climate action space is, youth felt that it's actually dominated by older folks and is structured in a way that leaves out marginalized or vulnerable youth. And sometimes they feel that younger generations are not taken seriously or their input is not implemented or even given an opportunity to share their input at these spaces. Furthermore, youth also feel that it takes a certain type of privilege to be able to focus on being environmentally conscious and sustainable, where some youth are just focused on getting basic necessities, whether that means that it's environmentally friendly or not, they don't care because they just need to survive. So not everyone is coming into the environmental and climate action space equitably and with at the same playing field. In terms of health and wellness, no surprise that we know that not everybody has access to healthcare in the same manner, and especially youth struggle with this a lot because not everyone is treated equitably by the healthcare professionals that they interact with, if they even get that far. Some services are not even accessible to certain youth, for example, mental health services, as I mentioned before, because of the expense that's involved and also the transportation that's involved. And over the pandemic, yes, there were a lot of remote or virtual opportunities available, but again, that cost of having technology or being able to pay for that service is quite high. And especially youth that are living in rural or reserve communities are not able to access these services or may not even know about these services. And for those that do know about them, getting to and from medical appointments is very time consuming for them. And they might have to take a day off work, or as you know, there's long wait lines. And it's just not worth letting go of work time or being paid from work to be able to go into a hospital or a doctor's office, for example. Youth also discussed that there's a variety of factors that they feel contribute to healthcare inequities, and these include marginalized identities, ableism, racism, classism, sexism, geographical location, lack of culturally responsive resources, which I think is a big one, inadequate nutrition and wellness education, and of course, food insecurity. And those can definitely be broken down much further, and it's all in the report, but just a brief synopsis. In terms of leadership and impact, this was a section that I was very passionate about because I relate so much to it. And I actually worked on this section myself, but all the youth that we spoke to, most of them felt that access to a strong network in order to secure leadership opportunities is not accessible for everybody. Many leadership opportunities are actually unpaid, which low-income youth simply cannot afford. And I think in today's time, and even youth who may be able to, with everything, the prices of everything going up, it's just not a viable option for many people. And volunteering their time without any kind of compensation or any kind of return is just not, it's just not an option. Youth noted that the importance of higher education in the current job market and economy makes it extremely difficult for them for those youth who face barriers to post-secondary education. So without post-secondary education, they may not be able to access leadership opportunities, but again, they can't afford the post-secondary education because it's so expensive. And youth are also recognizing that education is an enabler, but it also does create barriers because not again, everyone is able to pursue education. And again, when youth are reaching out to people to connect with them or to mentor them, sometimes they're not taken seriously, or even youth don't necessarily know where to go to network with some people or where to go build, connections and engage with people at that level, especially during the pandemic, because it became extremely difficult for people to reach out to others and connect with them. And although again, virtually they could do that, but many youth did not have access to technology to be able to connect with people virtually. And then going into employment, so youth are facing many barriers to employment, of course, and this includes lack of technology, professional networks, and career development opportunities. It's very challenging for youth to find entry-level positions without experience, but many are not able to gain meaningful experience due to it being unpaid most of the time. So, they have to decide what's better for them. And youth are feeling that they need to right now focus on just finding a job that makes them money instead of building a career. Because they're not seeing the value in a career or to give up paid time to go get some experience and then go apply that in a career. Many students are also facing high rates of debt and student loans, and the cost of post-secondary education, as mentioned before, it just doesn't align with the salaries that they would be receiving from these jobs or careers that they would go into. And of course, youth with disabilities and other vulnerable groups face a lot of discrimination in employment as well, something that this report touched on in many, many ways, which we don't often hear about or discuss openly. In terms of innovation, skills, and learning, accessibility and the possibility of different educational settings via online engagement are important to youth. However, they're not always available. When we say different educational settings, what the youth mean is having an opportunity to learn outside of a school setting and that still be held in high regard. A lot of people feel because they only went to school up until grade 12 and they don't want to pursue a college or university education, they will not be viewed as viable candidates for jobs or opportunities in the future. Of course, access and quality of education is dependent upon location and wealth. And youth stated that Indigenous youth in particular have low rates of completing post-secondary education as a result of relevant ways of knowing and learning and transportation and other support systems. One positive thing in terms of innovation, skills, and learning that youth mentioned was that due to the pandemic and having a little bit more free time, a lot of youth were able to come up with entrepreneurial opportunities in their homes and create some sort of small businesses where they could try things out at home. So that was something that was really neat that we found when working on this report. So that was a synopsis of the report. And again, what stands out to me is just, again, this is nothing new, but it's always mind-boggling. You know, when we are looking at youth, these are not issues for youth who are privileged, educated, living in big cities, et cetera. These are, you know, issues that youth who are disadvantaged or marginalized are going through every single day. These youth do not come from a place of privilege. They are too busy to think about the climate crisis or networking because they're just busy with survival. And they're often not included in these conversations as much as they need to be. I'll wrap up there and pass it on to the next presenter.
Thanks, Manvir. And I think I saw lots of nodding heads, so I'm eager to hear Sydney, Fadumo, and Haleema, how that resonates with what you were finding as well. But Sydney, why don't we move over to you? I think that was an interesting transition from, you know, challenges that youth are facing to, you know, what your report said.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Natasha. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and to Tamarack for hosting this session. Today, I'm joining from the Greater Toronto Area, which is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I just want to acknowledge that. And as Natasha mentioned, last year I worked on the Raising Canada report with Children First Canada. And for those who are not familiar with Children First Canada, it's an organization that prides itself on putting children first, with a vision to make Canada the best place in the world for children to grow up. As a whole, the Raising Canada report aims to provide an overview of what the key impacts, or what we've labeled threats, affecting young people's health and well-being in Canada have been, based primarily on evidence that was published from the past year. And so the 2021 report was the fourth in the series of reports. The fifth report will be launching this year towards the end of summer. And the report really offers insights into steps and policy actions that are needed to respond to and mitigate these threats. So data that was collected for the Raising Canada 2021 report revealed that the same threats that were found in the Raising Canada 2020 report have continued to exist, although they have been actually amplified by the continued impact of the pandemic. And as we know, the pandemic is still going on, and so the impacts really have been crucial. The top 10 threats that we identified were unintentional and preventable injuries, poor mental health, systemic racism and discrimination, child abuse, vaccine preventable illnesses, poverty, food and nutritional insecurity, infant mortality, bullying, and finally, limited physical activity and play. And last year, we also highlighted 4 cross-cutting themes, which really are themes that intersect with all of the threats that were mentioned. And these included access to education and childcare, access to healthcare and social services, which I think Manvir was mentioning from her report, inequity and inequality, and climate change. And so based on today's discussion and today's focus of the webinar on climate, poverty, and affordability, I thought we could really briefly zoom in on the key statistics and information within the Raising Canada report that are related to poverty, climate change, and the cross-cutting theme of inequity. And so in relation to child poverty, high rates of child poverty exist across Canada, where almost 1 in 5 children live in poverty. That's 20% of children. This proportion leads Canada to be positioned 26 out of 38 affluent countries for its child poverty rate. So we're really not doing well. And also child poverty rates differ geographically across Canada, with the highest rate of child poverty being in Nunavut, and with 31.2% of children experiencing poverty, and the lowest rate being in Yukon, with 11.2% of children experiencing poverty. Racialized children and those who experience marginalization, such as Black, Arab, Korean, West Asian, and First Nations children, also experience heightened risks. So for instance, 53% of status First Nations children living on reserve live in poverty. That's 53%, just really mind-boggling numbers. For 2S LGBTQ plus youth, there's also increased rates of homelessness or housing insecurity, And living in poverty, as we probably all know, actually ends up worsening many of the other threats that are mentioned within the Raising Canada report, and really just continues to harm children and their families. Children as a whole are most at risk for climate-related health impacts as a result of direct and indirect effects of climate change, despite not having the opportunity to meaningfully engage in these conversations, as Manvir also pointed out. The effects of climate change have especially profound impacts on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and young people, and with the potential to really decimate traditional food systems and disrupt the rights and well-being of Indigenous communities. And the significance of these impacts is also acknowledged by young people themselves, which we've heard from Manvir in talking about the first State of the Youth report. And it was also mentioned in Children First Canada's Young Canadians Parliament, who we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But they also identified climate change as a key threat to children at the present moment and into their future, calling for immediate rectification. So throughout each of the threats, and you probably got this sense, we indicated based on the evidence that there's various inequities that have been raised and that are associated with elements of a young person's identity, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. And Manvir mentioned this in relation to Indigenous youth who, from their report, it was noticed that they face a higher risk of mental health conditions. And this was kind of reiterated in our report as well. And so where intersectional identities exist, these inequities are compounded. So for young people who may be Indigenous and female, or may be from the 2S LGBTQ community, really you see these inequities related to the threats being heightened. These disparities mean that young people who are racialized or face marginalization are more likely to experience the threats and see those threats heightened, especially in light of the pandemic. And so on the whole, these threats and the key statistics that I just mentioned highlight the ways in which children's lives in Canada are at risk, and that much more work is needed to motivate change. Maybe I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sydney. Haleema, you've been having lots of conversations with the Minister's Youth Council. How is what you're hearing related to some of what Manvir and Sydney have already shared with us?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of different issues ranging from like mental health and opportunities that both our panelists mentioned are relevant to youth. Specific issues pertaining to young people on the topics of affordability and climate, I've noticed have come up a lot. And I recently held like a few roundtables with youth at my old high school. And I was shocked to learn, even at the age of 14, 15, 16, youth are thinking about how they're going to afford living in the future, how they're going to afford getting groceries in the future. And it's really shocking to know that these issues at an age where they're not really supposed to be worrying about those sorts of things are still preeminent on their minds. And this is coming at a time where we're seeing a decline in home ownership among young adults. We're seeing an increased number of youth living with their parents and rising housing costs, as we all know. And I know this is definitely like Fadumo's area of expertise as well, affordable housing, and I know she'll touch upon this, but the cost of housing, the cost of living in Canada today, regardless of whether you're at the age of 23, 24, looking into getting a place to live, or you're 14, 15, still living with your parents, is something considerably important to young people right now. And then on the topic of climate, I've noticed, especially with conversations on the PM's Youth Council and within youth in my community, we're seeing a movement of youth climate organizations advocating for a variety of climate-related bills and policies. For example, we have the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which was introduced by Senator Rosa Galvez, and other bills pertaining to the impact of climate change on marginalized communities, which is something Manvir discussed in detail about, often known or curtailed as environmental racism. And so I think this need for Canada to keep up with their climate goals, to place pressure on financial institutions to not fund fossil fuel projects, are among other things, topics that have come up that I've experienced within engaging with youth. So we've also had a lot of conversations on the council about the relationship between how climate change is going to impact health and health outcomes among youth and that sort of thing. So I'll pass it on to Fadumo to touch upon it a bit more, but that's all for me.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and really talk about the affordability issue for young people in Canada. We released our Real Affordability Index early May of this year. And the goal of the Real Affordability Index was really to explore affordability of 27 cities in Canada. We did this in partnership with RBC's Future Launch, and we really wanted to investigate affordability and how it appears for many young people in many cities across our country. And we looked at young people from 15 to 29 and how they can afford to live in the cities that they do. And we noticed that regardless of the size of the city, big or small, that they were all dealing with issues of affordability. We noticed that our young people are living with an average deficit of $750 each month. When we were examining affordability, it was really important for us to look at it from the perspective that affordability is not really just about meeting the bare minimum, but allowing our young people having access to opportunities to help them develop and thrive. And what we noticed from the index is really that our young people are not having an equal access to opportunities that will allow them to develop and thrive. And, you know, a lot of the other panelists ahead of me really kind of elaborated in those, like the equity issues that young people face. Just to add to this conversation, I really wanted to share some of our key findings from our index. We noticed that young people, we noticed that salaries and wages for young people are not keeping up with the living costs in Canada. And we noticed that the minimum wage is really not a livable wage, and that there's usually a gap between about $2 and $10 in what is a livable wage. In our index of the 27 cities, we have Yellowknife at the top is with the highest index, the highest income, and Halifax at the bottom, and that dispersity is about 30%. What we also noticed is about 2/3 of our Canadian cities are still unaffordable, even if a young person has a full-time job. So this, you know, the status of their employment really doesn't make a huge difference because the sad reality is the wages are not keeping up with the livable costs. In terms of gender equity, our index really focuses on the two sexes, female and gender, because a lot of our data is sourced from Stats Canada, and Stats Canada hasn't really expanded looking in different gender identities. So what we notice is that the pay equity, even though there's so many efforts that have been gone into really creating pay equity, we're still noticing that young men are still making more money than young women in many of our cities. Oftentimes, females are working in more of service sector, and we found a correlation of young people that work in more service jobs tend to be the young people with the lowest wages and the lowest income each month. Since, you know, the past couple of months, since the release of our index, we've been really interacting with a lot of young people and hosting a lot of info session in different communities. And what we've noticed is that there's this financial anxiety that young people are dealing with, and just this worry about how are they going to, you know, pay for education, the rise in rent costs. And a lot of them are just kind of asking themselves, why is it so expensive just to exist? You know, I think it comes back to our perspective of affordability, and, you know, they want to, I think they're really tired about this idea of how do they break even every month and not give up the things that really make life fully enjoyable. You know, especially now that we're, you know, somewhat transitioning out of a pandemic, and there was a lot of young people really self-isolating, and the impacts of the mental health impacts of that, and what does that look like in the next couple of years for them. So there's a lot of conversations that we're having with young people, and those are the kind of the things that they're kind of sharing with us. I'll pass it back to Liz.
Thank you, Fadumo. And thank you to all of you for bringing to light the challenges and the issues that are facing young people in Canada, and more broadly, youth around the world too. So we've been talking about the what, so let's get into the how now. How can young people be effectively and authentically and meaningfully engaged in supporting either understanding these issues more or tackling those issues? So maybe Haleema, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I love this topic of youth engagement. And I think that when we discuss how to meaningfully engage youth, it begins by understanding why is it that your institution, your group wants to speak to young people in the first place. And to provide background, Canadian youth today are more digitally connected, educated, and diverse than ever before. And in understanding why youth are important to have at decision tables, it's not only because youth are going to be leading tomorrow, the leaders of tomorrow. I think that that perspective really negates how important and essential youth are to the functioning of Canada today. And with that in mind, I think that it's really important to first consider one of the worst ways to engage young people, and that begins with their tokenization. Why are they being called to your table in the first place? Are they simply there to check an institutional box that, hey, we talked to this young person and now we can move on with our plans? Or are they actually essential to the planning of whatever group it is that you're running? And so with that in mind, I found that from my experience being on the PM's Youth Council, I've had amazing opportunities of being able to engage with adults and leaders, and I've also had, quite frankly, awful opportunities. And so I think from my experience, those consultations where guests actively heard our input and actually wanted to know what we had to say felt the most successful. And what does that look like? That looks like them returning for future sessions or recommending our work to other agencies or actively changing drafts of projects or proposals. That shows that not only are they listening to what we have to say about a particular topic project, but they're here to change it and to change their decisions based off what we have to say as well. I think the second component to better youth engagement begins with accessibility. And I've heard this from so many of our other panelists as well. Oftentimes at these conversations, we see the most involved, the most academic youth, oftentimes the most privileged youth being consulted because, number one, they're often the ones who get to hear about these opportunities. And it is hard. It is hard to make sure that your engagement sessions, your consultations, the youth that you're reaching out to are representative of Canada, are representative of the people that you're supporting. And I think that as although it can be hard, there are a variety of methods that can be used to improve an institution's accessibility. I think that it begins with having very simple yet diverse and creative means of engagement. So for if you're working with students in a school or in some kind of educational group, having frequent surveys with students before making decisions or as you're deciding school plans is an idea. Hosting consultation meetings, but also having a lot of anonymous methods for youth to provide their input on the running of that group, I think is really important. But more than any of that, it's very important to have a culture within your institution, within your charity, within your organization, where youth feel comfortable actively sharing their opinion and feeling comfortable being able to reach out to a teacher or an adult and share that they don't really like the way that things are going right now. In my experience, there's been a lot of times where I've been really passionate about a topic and I've wanted to share it with a politician or a leader, but it felt very paralyzing to actually do so because I knew that they had a different opinion from mine and they probably wouldn't take me seriously if I were to share what I had to say. And so having that culture within your group is so important. And I think it can do far more than having a million meetings every single month or having a million surveys sent out. If at the end of the day, a young person feels like they can email that person and tell them how they feel. And I think lastly, having unique opportunities where youth can see their opinions actualized is essential. Of course, it's great to talk and to have conversations, but at the same time, it can feel like you're just tossing words out into the air and never really seeing where they land, how they're actually changing things. And so every group has some kind of tangible project going on, whether that's a new plan or a new project, that sort of thing. And so allowing youth to have input on more broader things and have conversations like these, but also provide input on tangible things is important. And how can this look? For provincial or municipal youth councils, political groups, allowing youth to comment on policy plans or new bills or new presentations. This can also be very relevant for schools who are always, releasing new projects and plans. And so there's a variety of different ways to allow youth to provide tangible input and also more broad and institutional input on whatever it is that they're engaging with. And I think Manvir also mentioned at the beginning, compensation is really, really important. I think that youth time is often taken advantage of and people need to be paid, they need to be employed, and not everybody can take on volunteer opportunities. And so in short, I think that ensuring that you're not tokenizing the youth, you're providing accessible opportunities and you're trying to represent as many backgrounds as possible through a variety of different engagement methods is really, really important. And I'd also like to share in the chat just an article that I wrote, which summarizes a lot of what I mentioned today on how to actively engage youth within your institution. So I'd like to pass it on to the next panelist.
Haleema, thank you for drawing such a great picture of what meaningful engagement is. That was excellent. Some really great philosophical and some concrete practical ways that people can take away with. And thank you also for sharing that, that article. We've also put in the chat Tamarack's Meaningful Engagement for Youth Guide. It also has some descriptions of principles and best practices that people can take away too. So thank you for that. And so now to Manvir, maybe you want to talk a little bit about engaging diverse youth.
For sure, and thank you, Haleema, for that. That was amazing. In my experiences, of course, I think everything Haleema mentioned is, I want to echo that, but I want to go a little bit deeper into when we're working with diverse youth, how we can make them feel engaged. So I have a lot of experience working with newcomer youth, as well as youth born or raised in Canada. And when I was doing that work, I found myself coming up with different and exciting ways to engage both groups, simultaneously, but making sure that everyone felt welcomed and engaged. And I think one of the key takeaways for me was listen to the youth. They'll tell you how they want to be engaged. They'll tell you what they expect out of this opportunity, and don't do the opposite. I think many times we get stuck, whether it's a funder's requirement or whatever project we're working on, the deliverables, to just literally tick mark a check, check off one of our requirements and just say, we had this many youth attend and here's a picture, and that's it. We never hear about that project again. The youth are never updated about it. And it kind of, it's useless for the youth. They're not taking anything away from that. And I think when we are creating opportunities for youth, especially those youth that are vulnerable, or for example, newcomer youth, or any youth that are not your privileged, traditional token youth that are coming to these things again and again, it's important to maintain that engagement for them to want to come back and share. So, being culturally sensitive and being open and aware that not everyone is coming in at the same playing level or from the same experiences, and understanding that is the physical space or the digital space that we're hosting these sessions or these interactions in, are they fair to everybody? Are they equitable to everybody? Does everyone even have access to a tablet or a laptop to join a virtual space? Are we making sure that there's interpretation in case they need that? Are we making sure that we can potentially figure out a way to make them feel safe enough to share? Because I know I've worked with youth who didn't have, English was not their first language and they were still learning, and they felt other youth were laughing at them, or sometimes even facilitators were kind of like, had a smirk on their face because the youth said a word funny. So are we making sure that we're being truly equitable and encouraging them to share what they want to share and then have that materialize? I think youth come, they share, and they have great ideas. Like, I've never not talked to a youth and said, that's a stupid idea, because they're talking about, something that's of value to them. But when we don't do anything with that idea, or we don't take it back and show them what we've implemented, I think it's a waste of their time and our time, frankly. And of course, when we're offering them this opportunity to really make sure it's a growth opportunity. So someone might be stepping out of their comfort zone for the very first time. Someone with a disability may be taking a leap of faith and saying, I'm going to go try this. And maybe, this is going to be the thing that's going to open a door for me. So are we making sure that we're providing them the guidance or the support that they need to come back and want to do it again? Or is it, again, just, a photo op for us, or to be able to say, we help this many youth? I also, I feel like the mentorship piece is so important that we don't often talk about. I wish when I was growing up, there were people that I could look up to. There were more people that I could look up to, or who would help me in my journey or my path. And I try to be that for the youth that I work with today, because I think that is so valuable, and it's not a one-time thing. I think it's a constant, it's obviously, we're not talking to our mentors every day, but to have someone in your life constantly that you can reach out to as a young person, I think it does wonders for people. And to feel that you feel understood and someone's not looking at you as like, you're a little kid, I have nothing to say to you. And I think that those are the kinds of growth opportunities that we need to give all youth, regardless of where they're coming from. And really, I'm sure all of us would have appreciated having someone to guide us through a difficult time or through an unfamiliar time. And that's what, in my experience, has been very successful with the youth that I've worked with. I no longer work at the same institution when I was working with these newcomer youth, but they are still in touch with me 5 years later. And I get to see their constant growth. And I'm happy knowing that I played a little part in that at some point in their life, and they're not going to forget that.
Thank you. And thank you for touching on that piece about mentorship and adult allyship. It's so important in young people's lives. Sydney, did you want to draw a build on that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I think, again, a lot of what Haleema and Manvir have said is really what we've been thinking at Children First Canada. So again, really shifting how we think about young people and their voices in the here and now, not just in the future, to make sure that engagement with young people is more accessible, which means really acknowledging the value they bring to the table, but also that that engagement is meaningful. So we're not treating young people as tokens, we're treating them as real partners with expertise. And I really think like shifting how we think about young people as a whole in the population is really what's necessary, because they are experts in the matters that affect them, and nobody can speak to those impacts and those threats in the case of the Raising Canada report as well as a young person can, because they understand what's affecting them in their daily lives. And while obviously it's important to have partners like clinicians, parents, siblings, et cetera, to assist with those discussions, it's the young person themselves that needs to be acknowledged as an expert. In the Raising Canada report, Children First Canada purposefully prioritize consultation and engagement with young people. So we had 2 youth who were part of the research team. They attended meetings, they gave feedback on the report. We also consulted with youth from various organizations in Canada, and they provided feedback on the report drafts to make sure that we were really framing the issues in ways that aligned with what they're seeing and the evidence that they've come across. And finally, we invited young people to contribute artwork. So again, coming to this place of accessibility, maybe some young people don't want to read a 50-page report, but maybe they find other ways to engage with the work. And we thought artwork was one tool to do that. And it ended up being a great opportunity for young people to really dig into these issues. Children First Canada, aside from the Raising Canada initiative, also has other ways to engage young people. So the Young Canadians Parliament, as I mentioned earlier, is a movement of young people under 18 who come together to talk about issues that matter to them and their peers with parliamentarians. And the Children First Canada Youth Advisory Council, which is one youth advisory council, but there's many across several institutions in Canada. And this really just brings young people together to talk about and provide expertise and advice on things that matter to them. I'll just highlight again this year for the Raising Canada report that's going to be released at the end of the summer. The Children First Canada Youth Advisory Council provided feedback along with some other youth advisory councils. So I would encourage everyone to read the report and see how we've engaged young people in that way.
Thank you, Sydney. And so speaking of like specific ways that young people can be engaged, Fadumo, did you want to touch on how young people are engaged in the research that you did?
In our research, we relied on 2 sources. One was we are firm believer in open source. We have an open source database that we call the Grid. We really want to make sure that we democratize the way young people can access the data. So we created this database where they can access the raw data of all of our indexes, which will help them in terms of their advocacy work and inspire them to do further research and also shape youth-informed policy. In particularly this index that we recently released, we surveyed young people across the country. And I think in that survey, our focus was really understanding costs and what they spend their money on each month. We really wanted to really broaden the definition of affordability. As I mentioned earlier, it was not just about the bare minimum of survival, like just like the food they buy, but like what all the items that they purchase every month. So for us, I think being a data-focused organization, our 2 key areas is really figure out ways that we can equip everyone, especially young people, to have access to data. Oftentimes young people are looked at as just like, they don't know what they're talking about. They're just kind of delusional, often and usually dismissed. So we want to make sure that they have the data to support the advocacy work that they are doing. and the different ways that they're engaging with different stakeholders. And another component of our work is really about educating young people on how to do data collection and data literacy work, and giving them the tools to activate data and allow them to really connect with a different audience that they engage with on a regular basis, such as funders, policymakers, and just community members when they're doing these like meaningful, evidence-based ways of approaching situations. So our focus are in those two areas. And I agree with a lot of what my previous panelists also mentioned in terms of engaging young people and how important it is. So I'll pass it back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Fadumo, and thank you to all of you. That was an excellent set of like a conversation around really concrete things that people can walk away with. So we're going to move into the question and answer phase of the webinar. We've got just 9 minutes left, so we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll give it a shot for some of them. If you have any additional ones, you're welcome to put them into the question and answer box. There's one that's very specific here around your report, Fadumo, if you wanted to take a stab at it. It's a question regarding the index. If the average monthly deficit is $750, how are young people continuing to live in the 27 cities examined? Is the deficit being bridged through debt, transfers from family, depletion of savings, etc.? This person is also curious if a study of this kind has been run in smaller cities. Are youth faring better financially in smaller, more rural centers?
In terms of the average $750 a month, it ranges between the size of the city. However, each city deals with some sort of level of deficit. So the bigger it is, sometimes it's higher. However, I think for whatever deficit they're dealing with, they are relying on debt to support themselves every month. They are, the young people that do have the privilege of family to support them, they are relying on them. As I think, as many of the panelists has mentioned earlier, a lot of young people are really living with their family currently. So, some of them have the privilege of that. So they're relying on family support.
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thanks, Fadumo. Now, one more broadly for everyone, how do you think social media can be involved in this kind of work of engaging young people? And I open that up to anyone who wants to take a stab at that.
Maybe I can start just in terms of that accessibility piece again. As I think the other panelists have mentioned, young people are very digitally knowledgeable. So if anyone can navigate a digital space to be engaged in these conversations, it really is youth. But I think, again, it comes back to how this engagement is framed. Is it really like a meaningful engagement where we're using social media to change, like to drive change, or is it something where it's kind of like a tool to kind of show that we're engaging young people, but not really meaningfully incorporating their feedback into the conversations? And obviously social media might be an easy way to do that. We might post a poll and then do nothing with that information. So it really comes back to like the ways in which social media is used, and having this principle of meaningful engagement at central to how that tool is used, I think.
No, that's great. That's an excellent answer. And then maybe connected to that, how can we engage sort of the non-token youth, those diverse youth, and have them participating? Are there other strategies?
I can try to tackle that one. I think it's really important, again, to identify people in your community who you see as youth who want to learn, but are, again, nervous or afraid or hesitant for whatever reason, right? Or just sometimes not in the limelight, but there's definitely those youth. And so first step would be to identify people who can then identify those youth. So whether that's a community leader or a youth worker or a youth network or a youth group that's working in the community, I'm sure they know people who are, again, just not as vocal or as out there or as as involved in the community as they'd like to be, but they're looking for someone again to just hold their hand and you know, bring them into this world and stay with them as they go through these experiences, hopefully positive experiences of being involved. But again, like I think, you know, the organization that I worked at never really engaged newcomer youth before I was there, but you know, me being hired by that organization and someone of a racialized background myself who could I also, I wasn't a newcomer, but I had the opportunity to live in another country for a couple of years and came back to Canada as a young person. And I knew, you know, similar like experiences. So I felt like they could relate to me there, and that made them comfortable to come out and just kind of want under obviously like in the beginning under like my shadow, but you know, then eventually grow into the role and feel more comfortable to be there by themselves and to openly speak up. And now, you know, I see those youth like leading clubs at school, and it's just really great to see. But I think it's just about identifying the right people to go out and you know, like honestly, like scout those other youth that are not your traditional token youth.
And just to add, I think that social media can play a pretty big role in this, not only in sharing whatever projects it is that your group is doing for youth, but also in seeing what issues are relevant to youth right now. It's something that I actually like to do a lot. We're just going on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, other things, and seeing what issues are trending, what topics are youth discussing that are important to them at the moment. And then you can in turn use whatever it is that you find to then target and change your plans or whatever project it is that you're trying to pursue. And so I think in combining that with ensuring that you're not tokenizing youth, knowing what it is that they actually care about and not some preconception on what issues you think are important to them can really help through social media. And a lot of youth organizations in Canada use Instagram especially to share, you know, their work. And so in reaching out to those organizations, you're also able to implement youth engagement within whatever it is you're doing.
Thanks, Haleema. And speaking of specific issues, then someone has a question, if any of your reports touched on it specifically, how youth want to be engaged in climate action.
So I'm discussing a particular report, but within the last few weeks I mentioned before, we've really seen a lot of youth organizations coming together to advocate for specific bills and proposals. And I'll be glad to share the links in the chat once I can, but generally we're seeing that a lot of youth want to put pressure on financial institutions to stop funding fossil fuel projects and other sorts of things that are really driving climate change. Canada is behind on a lot of our climate related goals, and we're seeing that youth organizations are not only holding the Canadian government to account and other financial institutions to account who are not really living up to their promises through advocating for particular bills in the parliament and that sort of thing. And so I would recommend looking into one organization is Regeneration. They're really talking about a lot of these topics, but I'll be glad to share other like youth organizations that are banding together to again advocate for these bills to pass in parliament.
That's great. Okay, so one more question we've got. So this is from Will. Good afternoon. Income inequality has one of the most severe impacts on people's abilities to face the consequences of the current climate crisis. In addition to the current issues and injustices facing youth now and in the future that all of you have touched upon, the Green Resilience Final Report, funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada, had a basic income as its primary recommendation to help underprivileged individuals face the worsening impacts of climate change. Do you feel that a basic income would be an important policy solution to the injustices and issues that you have all raised as well? Why or why not? That's an excellent question, Will.
I can try.
Sure.
I think it would be a start, but I don't know if it would, you know, solve all the problems that exist. Our living wage, our minimum wage right now is not the best, and it's definitely not, you know, you're not able to afford much on that, especially like with, you know, what's happening right now. I don't know if that's the solution, the one and final solution for everything, but it would definitely be a start in terms of getting the ball rolling. Yeah, anybody else want to jump in?
I think it probably comes down to affordability, and it addresses Fadumo's report. Really, if we have basic income, it addresses a lot of the challenges that young people are facing. And in fact, that brings us to the end of our question and answer time. And so thank you to all the presenters for answering the audience's questions, and to the audience for your thoughtful questions. And so I'll pass it over to Natasha.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everyone today on this panel for all the preparation that you put into this and for sharing the conversations and the recommendations that have been coming out of your reports. I just have a couple of closing announcements. First is a reminder to members of Communities Ending Poverty, and we can put this up on the screen. There are more details. We have a member gathering to bring all the poverty reduction collaboratives across Canada together on October 19th, 11 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We're reconnecting, celebrating successes, sharing aspirations for the work in front of us. So if you're a member, please remember to register your three free seats with myself or your manager of cities, Allison or Jill. If you're interested in this conversation and would like to learn more about the poverty reduction membership and aren't a member yet, you can reach out to me at my email address on the screen there. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, the next public webinar that may interest you takes place August 3rd. It's Sacred Civics, which will explore the intersections of social and climate justice, inclusivity, participatory design, healthy communities, and future cities. The registration link will be emailed to you with the recording after this.
So in a few days, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the recording of today's call. You can also email Natasha to provide feedback about today's webinar. We are always trying to improve on this experience. And so thank you again to everyone for joining us. And thank you to our speakers, our panelists, and we hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you.